Why should we believe Jesus' reinterpretation of the Messiah rather than the one that the chief priests and the people held? No scholar denies that individuals and groups saw postmortem appearances of Jesus. The only question is...
To Ben Shapiro's credit, he's open to talking to people he doesn't agree with. And it's one thing when you're doing that with politics, but it's next level when you do it regarding religion, especially if you take your religion seriously. And Shapiro is quite famously an Orthodox Jew. And a while back, he invited Christian apologist William Lane Craig on his Sunday special show to talk about Judaism and Christianity. And Craig, this is why we're doing this, is a study in addressing the core issues that should be addressed when it comes to Jesus. And if you don't know who William Lane Craig is, he is, in my opinion, the preeminent Protestant Christian apologist out there today, if you measure that by experience and credentials and just good sense. So whether you like him or not, or agree with him or not, he's a brilliant man who has spent his life debating the greatest thinkers in the world in defense of the historical Christian faith. I'm Brett, and I've been a pastor a long time, and here at One Life Network, we love having these kinds of conversations because we believe they benefit believers and unbelievers alike. So, as Shapiro asked a great opening question, enjoy Craig's straight-on, informed, articulate answers, and I want to lock down a couple things on the post side of this.
So, what is the proof that Jesus was who he says he is in the gospel?
Well, first we need to establish who he thought he was. When you look at the religio-historical context of the life and ministry of Jesus, I think you can show that among the historically authentic words of Jesus were claims that he thought he was the Jewish Messiah, that he believed himself to be the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish kings and prophets, and finally, that he thought that he was the Son of Man predicted by the prophet Daniel, to whom God would give all dominion, power, and authority. So he had this radical self-understanding of being Messiah, Son of God, and the Son of Man. And
that's absolutely crucial, and we need to keep our eye on that.
Trial scene before the Sanhedrin in Mark 15, all three of these titles come to a head when the high priest asks him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, that is the Son of God?" And Jesus says, "I am." And then virtually quoting from Daniel, "And you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of the power." And at that point, the high priest rips his robes and says, "You have heard the blasphemy. What more witnesses do we need?" And Mark says they all condemned him as worthy of death. And that enabled them, since they didn't have the ability to carry out capital punishment, to deliver him over to the Roman authorities by slandering him as a pretender to be king of the Jews, and therefore a political figure who could be tried for treason and sedition and crucified.
So from the Jewish perspective, this narrative has some holes in sort of Jewish philosophy. The narrative begins with the idea that Jesus appears in front of the Sanhedrin and then claims to be the Messiah. Well, there's nothing actual criminally in any of the tractates that say that if you declare yourself the Messiah, this is actually a punishable offense, even. Right. There are many Jews, including Bar Kokhba, who have declared themselves messianic figures.
Absolutely.
The real gap here is that in the Gospels, Jesus' vision of himself as the Messiah is completely different from the prior vision of what the Jewish Messiah is, and is actually outside the scope of how Jews describe the Messiah, or really have ever described the Messiah. The Messiah in Judaism has always been a political figure who is destined to do certain things, restoring the kingdom of Israel, maintaining control of that kingdom, bringing more Jews back to Israel. All of these things are considered sort of political things that the Messiah does. But the idea of the Messiah as embodiment of God is something that's foreign to Jewish religious philosophy going all the way back to the beginning. So even the idea that the Sanhedrin would be questioning him in those terms and would get from that what he means is, I am God, which would be a much more punishable offense, presumably that would be actual blasphemy. It's an oddity.
I think,
well, and it's very important to hear an Orthodox Jew articulate that objection, and it's great and helpful if you're a Christian to listen to Craig's response.
You're absolutely right in saying that Jesus' understanding of the Messiah was radically different from the prevailing cultural understanding of the Messiah among the chief priests and the common people. And he didn't meet their expectations. Indeed, that's what helped to get him crucified. Being the Messiah, you're right, in and of itself isn't a blasphemous claim. But to claim to be the Son of God in a unique sense, and then especially the Son of Man prophesied by Daniel, sitting at the right hand of the power, that is truly blasphemous and is sufficient for his condemnation. Now, the question, I think, that is raised by your
interpretation,
question, Ben,
yes.
your interpretation, Ben, is this. Why should we believe Jesus' reinterpretation of the Messiah rather than the one that the chief priests and the people held? And I think the answer to that is his resurrection from the dead. Jesus' resurrection from the dead is Yahweh's public and unequivocal vindication of the man whom the chief priests had rejected as a blasphemer. It is the divine demonstration that these allegedly blasphemous claims are in fact true, that he was who he claimed to be, and that therefore I follow Jesus in his conception of what it means to be the Messiah.
Now, do everybody well to write that down, what he just said, because it is absolutely critically important.
So when it comes to the resurrection, why is resurrection proof of divinity? So Lazarus is resurrected.
That was why I wanted to emphasize the religio-historical context before we talked about the resurrection. A miracle taken...
And that's something else we all ought to do, is import religio-historical context into how we talk. It's a nice sounding thing.
In isolation is inherently ambiguous. The proper interpretation of a miracle is going to be given by the religio-historical context in which it occurs. And the resurrection of Jesus is not just the resurrection of any old body. It's the resurrection of the man who claimed to be Messiah, Son of God, and Son of Man, and who was crucified for those allegedly blasphemous claims. If God has raised this man from the dead, then he has, I think, unequivocally and publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims.
So one of the counterclaims to some of this is that the Gospels are written significantly after Jesus lives. Even the earliest Gospel is written, 70 CE? Somewhere 40 years after Jesus is crucified. So what's to say, that like most historical events, there is some play in the joints here. So that this would be the historical argument against the exact veracity of the gospel revelations, for example.
Now, I think it's important to understand, Ben, that in order for a historical document to be reliable, it isn't required that it be inerrant.
Contemporaneous, of course.
So,
of course.
What I would argue is that underlying the inference to the resurrection of Jesus are three great independently established facts, which are supported by the historical evidence, and which surprisingly, I did my doctoral work on this in Germany, are recognized as such by the majority of New Testament scholars today who studied the historical Jesus. And these facts would be that after his crucifixion and burial by a member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea, that Jesus' tomb was discovered empty on the first day of the week by a group of his female followers. Secondly would be that various individuals and groups of people then witnessed appearances of Jesus alive. And finally, number three would be that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. The vast majority of scholars have come to accept as convincing the evidence in support of those three facts, not assuming biblical inerrancy or inspiration, but treating the Gospels as ordinary historical documents. You can show, for example, that the fact of the discovery of the empty tomb is attested by at least 6 independent sources in the New Testament, some of which are extraordinarily early. No scholar denies that individuals and groups saw postmortem appearances of Jesus. The only question is whether you should or could dismiss them as hallucinatory. And again, nobody denies that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. So these three facts are pretty firmly established, and the only question is then how do you best explain them? And down through history, attempts have been made to explain these facts without recourse to the resurrection, like the conspiracy theory, the apparent death theory, the hallucination theory, and so forth. And I would argue that none of these naturalistic theories meets the criteria for being the best historical explanation of the facts. None of them is as good an explanation as the one that the original disciples gave, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And if that's right, then I think we have good grounds, indeed are almost compelled to revise our typical understanding of who the Messiah was supposed to be.
So
Now, all that together, that was really, really good stuff, just summing up the essentials of what it means to believe in Jesus, especially his resurrection.
we can have the historical argument back and forth, obviously, and I think that there are arguments that you can make. I think there are arguments that I can make, but I honestly
Yes.
find them relatively uninteresting is the truth.
I'm going to argue that that was a punt by Shapiro in the end, especially I'm saying he was uninteresting. I mean, come on, that he asked the question and he gave him a great answer. But with that said, I think there's a few things that are critical to lock down that Craig is very, very good, and we could all go to school on this, at just getting it down to what the real issues are. And to Shapiro's credit, he asked good questions. Now, first of all, there's dealing with the historical figure of Jesus. How did he perceive himself, and what is the evidence lead? You don't have to believe who he was saying he was, but you just need to know that who he did claim to be. What does the evidence suggest? I do the same thing for Muhammad, but I know he claimed to be a prophet of God. That doesn't mean I have to believe him, but that does mean I can take him on his terms, and that's true of Jesus. And that's very, very important to do. What was his self-understanding? And I love the discussion they had about the redefinition of the Messiah, because it is a Jewish pushback. He came up with this idea of Messiah that no one had ever thought of. Well, that's very evident in the Gospels, and it's very evident to the original apostles. And they were saying, yeah, he completely rearranged that idea. And the disciples themselves struggled with that concept. That's one of the evidences that I believe it was really real and he was telling the truth, is because the New Testament comes out with that they struggled with that very idea that Shapiro brings up. But then, of course, the discussion around the resurrection and William Lane Craig's presentation of it using the three facts and all of that kind of thing is something that you and I ought to grab a hold of, because I like to think of it this way, that I treat the building of my Christian beliefs as resurrection outward. In other words, take the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus all together and then move out to the various places that maybe you struggle with, whether creation going backwards or the future going ahead, meaning that he pointed out that the early disciples, they viewed the resurrection a few different ways. You have to understand its history, but its meaning. It was for them, and Paul says it this way in Romans. He says, this was affirming that what Jesus claimed to be, being the Son of God and the Daniel 7 and all that kind of stuff, was really real. I mean, that was the affirming move. That's the whole point of the resurrection. Not to mention life after death and hope and all those kinds of things that go with it. That's how it functioned. And so knowing and understanding that it's historical, going all the way back to very, very early in historical documentation, and then the evidence of the apostles' lives and everything else is, and his words are, those things should compel us to receive as truth Jesus' interpretation of who he was. Now, when it comes to that, they brought up Daniel 7, that whole Son of Man thing. Alex O'Connor went on Jubilee and claimed that Jesus didn't claim to be God. And it's really important to understand that Daniel 7 thing when it comes to that entire question. I think it all hinges on that. And Craig pointed that out as well. So we did a video on that. Check this out. Hope that helps. See you next time.